Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Peace and blessings be upon you. Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Kuria said that the Palestinians want to create a binational state, demanding the same rights that the Israelis enjoy. Meanwhile, Israel implemented its threats by taking over parts of the West Bank. Kuria clarified that the situation on the ground is of major concern, since Sharon is moving forward with his plans of depriving Palestinians of their land, thus preventing them from creating their own state.
The most frustration issue now, it's the wall. What the wall? With the wall, with continuing constructing the wall, if they will continue constructing the wall, I don't see that the two-state vision is possible. But President Bush's vision about two states, Palestinian and Israeli state, I don't think that it will be possible. Not at all. Because the wall, as it's planned, it is not for security.
Palestinian President Yasser Arafat participated with members of Fatah in celebrating the 39th anniversary of the founding of the movement. Members of the movement who gathered at Arafat's headquarters raised Palestinian flags and pictures of Secretary General of Fatah Marwan al-Barghouti, who has remained in an Israeli jail for the past 2 years. In his speech, Yasser Arafat praised the Palestinian people's steadfastness in the face of Israeli pressure. Following a 3-week Israeli military operation in Nablus, the occupation forces are withdrawing, leaving behind massive damages, especially in the old city. However, the Israeli forces are still surrounding the city, leading to food shortages and preventing the citizens from acquiring their basic needs.
The blood is still wet on the ground, and the destruction in the old city of Nablus has left dozens of families homeless. 19 people were martyred and more than 200 others were wounded in 3 weeks. The Israeli army tightened its grip on the city, looking for the Palestinian resistance fighters, failing to arrest anyone. The Abdel Hadi Castle is a historic landmark in Nablus, housing dozens of Palestinian families. Israeli bulldozers tore the castle's walls down and destroyed people's belongings.
They forced us all out, even the children who are 1 and 2 years old. What can we do? We went out to the street, but God bless the Aslan family. They took the Aryun family in, and they took us, the Abdul Qadir family. 50 people in one house.
We managed to enter Nablus by hiding amidst a crowd of foreign journalists. Nablus, however, remains under tight siege, while a number of its neighborhoods continue to be raided following their withdrawal from the old city. This Israeli siege is contributing to the suffering of the Palestinians due to a shortage in the food supply and in baby formula.
This is a human catastrophe, and there is a shortage of many things. They conducted their operation while imposing a curfew and surrounding the city. We are still under siege, and it is difficult to bring supplies into the city. You even experience great difficulties in entering the city.
The surrounding refugee camps were not spared the destruction either. Even the villages and towns around Nablus were attacked. 3 weeks of bloodshed and destruction. Today, Nablus is trying to heal its wounds, but while the oppressed here are attending to their wounds, the international community is seeking to deliver a Palestinian truce to Israel on a silver plate. Meanwhile, the Israeli tanks keep on raiding the city. Majid Saeed, Abu Dhabi Television, Nablus.
In Iraq, the coalition forces are releasing a number of detainees in custody since last April at the Abu Ghraib prison. They are being released under the condition that those who bail them out ensure that they will stay away from all violent crimes and that they are guaranteed by religious or tribal leaders.
The Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad is a symbol of the previous regime's oppression of the Iraqis. The regime has collapsed. However, the prison still remains, holding those detained by the coalition forces after taking control of Baghdad on April 9, 2003. 2 trucks departed from the prison compound, carrying a number of Iraqi detainees released by the U.S. forces, who stated that they were detained for security reasons. The detainees' families have been waiting in front of the prison gates since the early hours of this morning.
When are they going to be released? People have been waiting for this pardon since 5 and 6 in the morning.
The detainees are being released with the precondition of staying away from criminal activity and that they are guaranteed by a religious or tribal leader. A detainee is also released if he is sick. It is unknown exactly how many are detained at the Abu Ghraib prison. However, there are reports that about 500 detainees will be released.
Of course, this is not enough. There are more than 15,000 people detained.
The United States Civil Administrator in Iraq, Paul Bremer, stated that the detainees to be released should not be directly linked to the attacks on the coalition forces, and that they have not committed any crimes against humanity.
In Iraq, a deadly attack on U.S. occupation forces in the capital early Wednesday killed at least 1 soldier and injured around 34 others, some seriously. This comes amid preparations for a massive U.S. military movement involving some 250,000 U.S. soldiers into and out of Iraq and Afghanistan by next May.
Wednesday marked a deadly attack with 6 mortar shells on a U.S. occupation military base west of Baghdad, where at least 1 soldier was killed and 34 others were injured, some seriously. The latest deaths bring to 332 the number of American casualties since U.S. occupation troops invaded Iraq on March 19th, with more than 2,400 injured. A British soldier was also killed during a military training range near the southern Iraqi city of Basra Wednesday morning. The United Kingdom's Defense Ministry said the death did not involve hostile activity and will be under investigation. 56 British personnel were also killed since the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. This came as one of the biggest movements of U.S. forces since World War II gathered steam Wednesday with the departure to Iraq of infantry troops from the elite 87 Airborne Division as returning soldiers arrived at an army base in Kentucky. The soldiers were part of a rotation of U.S. forces that will move some 250,000 troops into and out of Iraq and Afghanistan by May. Separately, in the northern town of Baquba, U.S. forces carried out a raid and arrested at least 4 people. According to witnesses, the raid was aimed at the house of the daughter of former Iraqi Interior Minister Mohammad Zumam. The former minister has been in the custody of U.S. occupation forces since the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. Soldiers opened fire against the house and also hit some of the shops next door and detained one of Zumam's relatives. Other houses were raided in the same neighborhood and 3 other people were arrested. So far, there has been no official report from the occupation authorities regarding the raid and the arrest. Pilots and crew members from Iraq's national carrier Iraqi Airways demonstrated with airport employees in Baghdad on Wednesday. Chief Flight Engineer Akram Muhammad said they were demonstrating because foreign airline companies were being used instead of Iraqi Airways.
We demonstrate here today because they bring a foreigner airline company instead of Iraqi Airways, and the Iraqi Airways is able to take the Hajj and they give it to the foreigner airline, and that means they want to finish the Iraqi Airways.
Iraq Airways was banned from flying to international destinations by a United Nations embargo in 1990. In May 2003, the UN Committee monitoring sanctions against Iraq announced that the flight restrictions had been removed following the Security Council's decision to lift sanctions. But the state-owned airline has been grounded since the start of the US-led occupation offensive, and the international airport is still restricted to military flights.
Israeli Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu urged his government to resume peace negotiations with Syria, arguing that Israel was in a strong position to obtain concessions. He explained that pressure on Damascus and the aftermath of the war in Iraq provided an unprecedented opportunity to reach an agreement without withdrawing from the Golan Heights occupied by Israel in 1976 and annexed 14 years later. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad wraps up today his historic three-day visit to Turkey. The visit was hailed by both sides as a turning point in the process of bilateral relations. And observers say the spectacular rapprochement between the two former foes might lead to important international gains for the two neighbors in a troubled region. Before leaving, Assad held talks with businessmen and opened stock exchange in Istanbul. There was an obvious pleasure in Turkey and Syria over the outcome of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's landmark state visit to Turkey, the first such visit by a Syrian president. The spectacular rapprochement between the two former foes continued on Wednesday, with Assad meeting high-ranking Turkish politicians and officials, including Foreign Minister Abdullah Gül, the leader of opposition Republican Turkish party Deniz Baykal, and Turkey's Chief of General Staff Hilmi Özkök. Aside from the boosting of cooperation, the trust developing between Ankara and Damascus might lead to important regional and international gains for the two neighbors in a highly troubled region. Syria could use warming relations with Turkey, a US ally and a NATO member, to ease ties with Washington, which is exerting heavy pressure on Damascus. And Turkey, which is also close to Israel, might increase its credibility in the Middle East. At the same time, US and Israel see this rapprochement with a bitter eye, as both seek to isolate Syria and force it to change its regional policy. But the Turkish-Syrian talks showed that the two countries' views on the Middle East have more common points than differences. The Kurdish issue, which once threatened to spark a war between the two sides, is now an element of rapprochement, since both sides fear a separate Kurdish entity in US-occupied Iraq may encourage Kurdish separatism in Syria and Turkey. And both countries have made clear that all disputes on water and the border should no longer poison their relations. Turkish diplomats say they see this visit as the beginning of a new period in which relations will be put back on track. And the official Syrian press said the visit is a strategic turning point in the process of bilateral relations. Turkish Energy and Natural Resources Minister Mehmet Hilmi Güler said the possible water export to Israel will be discussed by Turkish officials following the Israeli cabinet's approval of the plan on Sunday. He confirmed the move was political. For his part, Israeli National Infrastructure Minister Joseph Paritsky said Israel plans to start importing water from its key Middle East ally in 2006 for two reasons. One, they need water, and two, to strengthen their ties with one of the most important countries in the world for them. He added there were other interests than just buying water. Turkey will ship the water to Israel in specially built tankers.
Yes, it is political. We have spoken about the issue with Israeli ministers last time they visited Istanbul. We spoke about the schedules, but there were several delays. Now, with this development, our government should discuss the issue again.
I think the Israeli side want to talk about the water to have something to put the news about the water in front of the news of the visit of the President Bashar Assad to Turkey, because everyone knows that this visit will give the Turkish-Syrian relation a lot of pressure to have a big role for the Turkey in the Middle East, and I think the Israeli side will not be satisfied about that.
Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Qureya has said Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's unilateral steps will not allow for a two-state solution. In the meantime, Israeli forces killed a Palestinian in the Gaza Strip. Showing maps of where a separation wall had already been erected into Palestinian territory, Qureya said Israel was seeking to impose an apartheid solution. Sharon has said he would annex chunks of the occupied West Bank and unilaterally draw what he called security boundaries, stripping Palestinians of land they would get through the roadmap peace plan if they fail to stop attacks and come to the negotiating table. The Palestinian Prime Minister said the conditions on the ground were moving in the direction of the implementation of unilateral moves that would lead to the encirclement of some Palestinian territories within a fence and the annexation to Israel of some other areas.
The most frustration issue now, it's the wall, what the wall. With the wall, with continuing constructing the wall, if they will continue constructing the wall, I don't see that the two-state vision is possible. But President Bush's vision about two states, Palestinian and Israeli state, I don't think that it will be possible. Not at all. Because the wall, as it's planned, it is not for security. And naive who say that it is for security. The wall, it is to mark unilaterally the borders.
In Ramallah, Palestinian President Yasser Arafat addressed supporters during a ceremony marking the anniversary of his Fatah movement. Crowds waved flags and chanted in support of the Palestinian leader who has been under siege in his battered compound for more than 2 years. And in continuing violence, hundreds of mourners buried a Palestinian man who was killed last night by Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip refugee camp of Rafah. Witnesses said troops guarding a Jewish settlement fired into the neighboring refugee camp, killing a man in his home. They said the 42-year-old victim was closing a window in his home when troops fatally shot him. An Israeli military spokeswoman denied there had been any operations in that area. As U.S. presidential elections get closer, George Bush has put U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell to justify his administration's foreign policy in the world hotspots. He talked about Korea, Libya, China, Iran, Iraq, and the Middle East process, the progress and the challenges, but at the end of his speech, he said that there are still challenges and thus the path that has started must continue. But once he finished, the press applied its heat. Most of the questions focused on Iraq and the Middle East. On Iraq, Powell was grilled on the lack of weapons of mass destruction and whether war should have been declared. At this, Powell maintained the government's line.
Fact of the matter is, Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction and programs of weapons of mass destruction and used weapons of mass destruction against Iran and against their own people. That's a fact. Now, that's back in 1988 when they used it against their own people. But throughout the 90s, when they had every opportunity to come clean, make the declarations, and get right with the international community, they had the chance to respond to every one of those UN resolutions during the 90s, when they were threatened by President Clinton in 1998 with a bombing, and they still didn't come clean. And then they caused the inspectors to have to be forced out of the country. There is, I think, a solid case that has been made to many governments by their intelligence agencies.
To the Palestinians, 2003 was a year of resistance and struggle against the brutal and systematic Israeli war for the third consecutive year. The right-wing coalition government led by Sharon is leading this war after he won the Knesset elections for the second time. Last year was very difficult for the Palestinians as the Israeli war machine continued enforcing curfews and continued the war of extermination. The Zionist entity also embarked on building the apartheid wall and expanded the construction of settlements. Meanwhile, hundreds of Palestinians were martyred and thousands of others were either injured or detained. Sharon concluded last year like he started it, with incursions, assassinations, settlement expansions, and speeding the construction of the apartheid wall.
Another year has passed in occupied Palestine as the Zionists added more massacres and inhumane practices to their record against the Palestinian people. Incursions in the occupied Palestinian land continued. Home demolition continued. Killing and shooting Palestinians all over their land in Gaza and the West Bank also continued. The number of Palestinians who were martyred exceeded 2,500. However, the Intifada, which entered its fourth year, also continued. In late April, the roadmap was officially announced as Mahmoud Abbas was appointed as the first Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, a position that was recently invented. The Palestinians accepted the roadmap, which suggested achieving a peaceful settlement in intervals, ending with the establishment of the Palestinian state by 2005. On the 25th of June, Palestinian resistance factions announced a ceasefire agreement as a goodwill gesture. However, the occupation forces refused the ceasefire in theory and enforced that position with actions. The Israeli government continued with the incursions into Palestinian lands and assassination operations. The most prominent Palestinian figures that were targeted were Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, Mohammed al-Zahar, Ismail Haniyeh, and Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi. Israeli assassination operations, which were mainly intensified in May and June of 2003, killed and injured dozens of Palestinians, including women and children. The occupation forces assassinated Ismail Abu Shanab and Ibrahim Muqaddimeh and other resistance leaders, but still the Intifada continued. While these events were taking place, the Palestinian Authority was unstable at the mercy of Washington's decisions and conditions. Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas resigned and was followed by Ahmed Correa, the president of the Legislative Council. However, the most important event is the persistence of Sharon's government in constructing the apartheid wall, even after the United Nations General Assembly condemned the construction and demanded that it stop. The United States criticized the wall, but later it turned out that it was only doing so to avoid embarrassment by supporting the wall that was received by wide-scale international criticism. The separating wall will isolate more than 600,000 Palestinians from their land and homes. More than 20% of the West Bank will be taken to construct the wall, isolating dozens of villages. Hundreds of Palestinian farmers will not be able to reach their land, and thousands of children will not be able to reach their schools. The most outstanding massacre that Sharon committed in 2003 took place in Rafah city and Gaza in general. More than 100 Palestinians were martyred in separate airstrikes. Sharon also carried out brutal crimes in Nablus city, where at least 100 Palestinians were martyred, including a large number of children. Shedding the blood of Palestinians was always overshadowed by international silence, with a few exceptions that rose recently. Most importantly, 60% of the Europeans who participated in a survey said that Israel posed the biggest threat to international security. Considering the Israeli inhumane practices and acts of terror, several questions remain unanswered. What kind of peace are the Israeli occupation forces talking about, and what choice do the Palestinians have but to continue their resistance?
The Israeli plan to double the number of settlers living in the Golan Heights over the next 3 years was a message to the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This was confirmed after the Ministerial Housing Committee approved the plan during a recent meeting. We leave you with our reporter Eli Nissan.
The Ministerial Housing Committee approved the plan to double the number of people living in the Golan Heights in the next 3 years, which evoked mixed reactions. The Israeli Agriculture Minister, Israel Katz, said that it is not linked to Bashar al-Assad's announcement of his desire to resume peace negotiations with Israel, adding that Assad is a man who double talks.
The plan is good because it sends a message to the Syrian president Israel will develop and extend settlements there. There is no way that a leader who hosts and speaks with terrorist leaders can dictate what Israel should or should not do with territories that fall under its control in the Golan Heights.
Aren't you closing the door to negotiations with Syria?
There is no link between this matter and negotiations with Syria. The United States just announced that Syria supports terrorism. We also read in newspapers that the United States is studying the possibility of launching a war on Syria.
What about the Peace for Land initiative? Is it still applicable?
In my view, Israel should always remain in the Golan Heights. Assad lost the war, and now the Golan Heights is under our control. There are residential areas there. It is no longer possible to conduct real negotiations with this kind of a leader. We are talking about a man who double talks. He says one thing, but in reality does the opposite, and the Americans know that. He actively supports terrorism against our citizens.
As always, the time is suitable to build the country without taking money from budgets allocated to the disabled, healthcare services, or education. The money should come from priority funds designated to strengthen the attachment of Israel to lands of the Galilee, Golan Heights, and the Negev Desert.
A spokeswoman for the Prime Minister's office was angered by the plan, saying that it is unfortunate that this matter is being used to advance the interests of certain political parties. He confirmed that this plan was approved before the Syrian President announced the peace initiative. In addition, Knesset member Abraham Borg criticized the plan.
The 1967 line is the border between us and Syria. If we willingly accept that, then we can achieve a wonderful, peaceful agreement. If we choose not to do that, unfortunately, the international community will force us to do so. I must say that the residential concentrations will not stay there. They want to put some obstacles in his way and provoke him. Nothing real or good can come out of this.
The Minister of Infrastructure said that he supports this plan, but he has reservations about allocating large sums of money to the Golan Heights at this time.
The Golan is an inseparable part of Israel. I want people to settle in the state of Israel. I think that settling has a noble value. However, like everything else, we must do that wisely and in a reasonable way. We should not do that randomly.
The Jewish residents of the Golan Heights were pleased with the government's decision to build more residential concentrations and increase the number of people living in the area. The overwhelming majority of the residents chose to live there because of the quietness and good environmental conditions. Residents say that the available resources for raising children are excellent. Furthermore, prices are very tempting, which make it easy for people to build or buy homes there. Some of them, the ones who have been living there for a long time, support the government's decision to allocate 250 million shekels to improve the infrastructure, like streets, schools, social agencies, and work opportunities.
I see how people are living in Tel Aviv. The younger generation has to live with the increased rate of crime, pollution, and economic hardships. All these things made me want to move out of this area. This is a village. Look at that view. We have clean air and a tranquil area.
Truly, I don't know. I support allocating money to the infrastructure, like the streets and healthcare services. We want to protect the environment in the Golan Heights, both on our farms and in our homes. I hope that funds will be allocated here if there are funds available for that purpose.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.